security, it's crucial for this conflict to come to an end within a reasonable time frame. So the overall question has been about what the role of the United Nations has played in the Russia-Ukraine war, and how effective they've been in mediating this conflict. Overall, I can answer based throughout my research that they haven't really exactly been the most effective, specifically given that, one, there has not been any peacekeeping mission in the sense of the Security Council deploying an actual mandated mission to protect civilians, to ensure hostilities decrease, and help engage with diplomacy. But this has to do with the fact that Russia has a permanent veto in the Security Council, and what that means is that there's 5 permanent members: the United States, France, the United Kingdom, China, and Russia. With that comes the ability to veto any resolution that they don't agree to. So in the Security Council, if they have a draft resolution, they're voting on it. But if Russia or the US vetoes it, it fails completely. You have to have each member to either abstain or vote in favor in order to get something passed. But so the guiding questions throughout my research were over historical actions that have been taken in similar events. So I looked at the Yugoslavic wars, the Chechenian wars, and the Russo-Georgian war, and how they mediated those. How effective have UN peacekeeping missions been in Ukraine and other conflicts? So I kind of tied that in with that historical context and analysis. What are the primary challenges faced by the UN and peace brokering efforts in Ukraine? And again, there's that veto power that Russia has, but it's also the inability. There's also an inability for the Security Council to actually come to a consensus and work together to kind of like compromise for the better outcome. Then I also looked at the approaches of the different UN bodies, so that the General Assembly, the Security Council, the International Courts of Justice, and other international organizations who have actually contributed more towards ending this conflict than that of the UN, whose mandate is to uphold international peace and security. And then the last question is more so to kind of help us reflect over everything else that has been learned throughout, and that's what lessons that can be drawn from the UN's involvement for Ukraine, and that could be used to inform future conflict resolution efforts. I conducted a variety of data analysis, literature review, case studies, and historical analysis throughout my research to help create my final conclusion, including reviewing academic articles, different historic books on the different historical wars, as well as online sources and the UN's vast collection of archives with a variety of resolutions and past history. The effectiveness of UN peacekeeping. So I've defined this as the reduction of violence, maintaining ceasefires, and long-term stability. This will help analyze how peacekeeping missions in the past were considered a success or a failure. And in this regard, historical successes would be the Yugoslav wars and the Russo-Georgian war. Both instances, peacekeeping missions were established and were extended several times, and ceasefires were able to be maintained. Currently, the Yugoslav wars technically have ended, but they are more considered frozen in time by ceasefires that are being maintained, no matter how finicky they might be. And then with the Russo-Georgian war, while the peacekeeping mission UNOMID has ended, that was as a result, again, of a Russian veto. Russia was involved in this war. They actually they actually invaded Georgia back in 2008 and annexed 2 of their territories, South Ossetia and I can't pronounce the other name, yeah, I can't pronounce that name, but those proclamations for independence for annexing those territories are worded almost the exact same as the proclamations to annex the 2 territories of Ukraine. Current challenges include that primarily that there has been no peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, with rising casualties as a result from what could have potentially been prevented. Here we have a timeline of the UN's involvement in the Yugoslav wars. So kind of more of an overview is for 1991, the UN became involved. They implemented arms embargo on military weapons and military equipment in Yugoslavia. In '92, they established UNPROFOR, which is the United Nations Protection Force in Yugoslavia, to ensure ceasefires were maintained and create grounds for diplomatic solutions. It would eventually be deployed in April of '92, and then between '92 and '93 of February, they would have their operations and mandate extended by the Security Council several times. The first time was to extend it to what, after Yugoslavia separated into the 5 republics of former Yugoslavia, they did this so the mandate could still continue. These were Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. In 1993, hostilities would break out again, and so they would put more. The Security Council passed resolutions that would demand a cessation of hostilities and also condemn the attacks against UN personnel. They would also then go on to expand the mandate a second time, and then the Secretary General would go and invite NATO to conduct airstrikes on the UN's behalf if tensions were not resolved. 1994 saw a number of ceasefires signed, which would freeze the conflict in place. These ceasefires are still in effect today. So Bosnia and Herzegovina signed a ceasefire agreement first, then Croatia. Then, given that these nations ended up complying with the UN orders to withdraw these at least the majority of these heavy military weapons, they had called off temporarily the airstrikes from NATO. Of course, they did eventually follow through with those airstrikes, given an increase of hostilities, but the airstrikes that were conducted ultimately became effective and essentially stopping the rest of the conflict. The mandate would end in March of 1995 for UNPROFOR and be renamed into the United Nations Protection Forces for long-term oversight of ceasefire agreements. The Chechen War and the Russo-Georgian War. So the Chechen Wars kind of encompass 2 separate wars. Both were begun under Russian President Boris Yeltsin, but the second one was waged largely by Vladimir Putin, who took over for Yeltsin at the end of 1999 when Yeltsin resigned. At that time, before that, President Vladimir Putin was the prime minister, but he largely was put in charge of that war in Chechnya. The UN would condemn this invasion, but that would be all they would actually do in both of these wars, which ultimately saw Chechnya now falling under the control of the Russian Federation. Then with the Russo-Georgian War, this is considered a UN peacekeeping success, even though while UNAMID was ended due to a Russian veto, the French President Nicolas Sarkozy brokered a ceasefire in 5 days. The UN had condemned and urged both parties to return to the past ceasefires, of course, but this is a crucial one in regards to my research, given that 3 months prior, both Georgia and Ukraine were promised future NATO membership, which is kind of the whole issue, according to Russia. That's the primary issue with the current conflict, is NATO wanting, or Ukraine wanting to join NATO. The significance of the current Russo-Ukraine war. So the primary challenges of the United Nations. There's political, operational, and legal, with the political being heavily that veto power and a lack of consensus amongst the permanent 5, which is why they managed to successfully call an emergency session of the General Assembly to act where they could not. However, the General Assembly is, whatever they act and pass is not enforceable because the enforcement power lies with the Security Council. Operational, the inability to enforce decisions because they turned the issue over to the General Assembly because they couldn't agree. Anything that's passed or demands cannot be enforced. Then the legal challenges, and really that permanent veto again is a huge, like the permanent veto has prevented throughout history a lot of conflicts from being solved quickly and effectively because it doesn't align with either the beliefs, ideals, or doesn't benefit one of the permanent five in some way. Primarily, this is between Russia and the United States and the Middle East, or relating to Ukraine. But as a result of these vetoes, it prevents punishment for violations of international law, as well as the structure of the UN itself limiting the methods in which it can actually create change to begin with. There are sanctions and punishments outlined in the charter and how to go about doing that, but you also need a permanent five, all the permanent five, to actually vote in favor of said punishments, which causes an issue when it's a permanent five member who's violating these articles. Implications for the failure of the mandate. The UN has failed to uphold international peace and security as outlined in the UN Charter when it comes in relation to Ukraine. And that's given the thousands of casualties and injuries on the Ukrainian side, is not exactly able to determine how many on the Russian side, because the Russian Federation has denied to release that information to the United Nations Chief Humanitarian Office. Reconstruction costs currently are estimated to be over $486 billion over the next decade, and those costs continue to rise. And due to that current continued inaction, we'll just see those continuing, which $486 billion is like 10 times that, about more than what the United Nations gets in funding a year. As the influence decreases due to a lack of action, more crises seem to emerge, and as a result, further inaction is taken. Capabilities to address the future risks. Currently, the present day increased risk for global war for World War III are quite higher than they were 10 years ago. This is given to, primarily because of lack of agreement, they lack to work together. The questions that have to be asked is, has the UN truly overall lost their ability to act and maintain international peace, just as its predecessor, the League of Nations, did, which is why we saw World War II partially. And perhaps is reforming the UN a better option, or maybe just an establishment of a new organization with more, even greater flexibility and more accountability. So different bodies, I have previously mentioned about actions that they've taken. So the Security Council has passed a few resolutions, but they have enforcement issues. Recently, in February of this year, they finally acted and passed a resolution calling for the swift end of the war. The issue is, it's calling for, it's not demanding. So that, because of that vague wording, it's more of a, hey, we're suggesting you do this, rather than, hey, you're going to do this. And while a good first step, it's not the one that is really needed. The General Assembly has done a lot more in regards to passing resolutions with humanitarian efforts, having more capabilities in that regard for enforcement, because they can make recommendations to other organizations or contact them and work together with them to get that humanitarian aid out there. The International Court of Justice has investigated genocide allegations and rulings against both Ukraine and Russia. Currently, those are in limbo as they still continue to debate those issues today. And the Secretariat has aided with coordination and communication, which is ran by the Secretary General of the United Nations. 2 minutes. Okay. Then we also had involvement by international orgs such as NATO, the World Health Organization, the European Union, the OSCE. They've contributed financial support, whether that be sanctioning Russia, helping fund humanitarian assistance, military training, refugee assistance, medicine, etc., or on-the-ground data. The overall results I have come to were while the UN has attempted to address violations to Ukrainian sovereignty, they have failed. And the table attached, there are some of the draft resolutions that were vetoed by the Russian Federation that would have done some kind of, committed to some kind of action that would have helped at least address some of the underlying issues. Today, thousands suffer from losses and injuries or both, and millions continue to be displaced. Here is just a table of some of those casualties that I had previously mentioned and injuries, with totals of casualties as of August 2024 being 11,743, and then injuries 24,648. Those numbers have changed and increased, however, since then. Conclusions: the UN has failed to be an effective peace broker, unable to punish violations of their own charter, to swiftly end the conflict, and to get around the veto of the Russian Federation. While somewhat effective, the veto power has become their overarching problem, as I had previously outlined throughout. And the lessons learned include historical, diplomatic, economic, military, and humanitarian lessons regarding the importance of peacekeeping missions, the need to reform the veto power, the impacts of sanctions in Russia, NATO's potential role, and importance for rapid aid and refugee protection. Here I've just got some areas of potential further research that I'm planning to do, such as what can be done so the UN can have better enforcement power. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Andy Gawolski for being a great mentor and professor and the supervisor giving me this opportunity. The National Science Foundation for financial support for this research. Kyle Richards over there, who's my friend and has aided me in my early historical research of tensions between Russia and Ukraine and keeping me motivated, and to everyone else who's supported me, whether I know of it or not. Here's my bibliography.